Brethren, happy Sabbath, Shabbat Shalom. Welcome to the Friday night Sabbathy Bible study for this 30th day of the 9th month. Kislev, as many of the Jewish people call it, on God's holy sacred calendar. And let me see what our note is saying. Okay, good. I see the signal coming through over on the monitor over to my left, so our live stream signal is going out. Okay, I'm happy to see that. And I'm doing tonight's Bible study from my kitchen downstairs in my home while we still work on getting the studio upstairs and the equipment and the software back in shape. That's getting me ready to, God willing, be able to move all of that into a big RV that, if God is willing, I've got my house already posted for sale in a few places. I've already had 3 people show an interest, and there's a lot of things we got to do, and we'll either do a sweat equity lease option or I'll tell you about that another time, maybe in an email or something. But what I think I can tell you about on the Sabbath is that God willing, my desire and goal to get an RV and travel from city to city, state to state, spending a week in one of our national United States parks here, parks there, and I can get out and meet some of you who tune in for Friday night Bible studies and Sabbath services in the morning from different areas where I've just been able to talk to you by email. Had email this week from Canada, email this week from a viewer overseas in one of the African countries. And I'm going to mention, I think we'll have time. Yeah, we'll have 2 hours for the service in the morning. I'm going to mention more of that in the morning and prayer requests, except I do want to mention one prayer request tonight for Fred Mobley, who is a longtime minister from Alabama who has been transferred from the St. Vincent Hospital, same hospital where many of our brethren go when they're sick in Birmingham, to a facility, a locked-in facility, because he has COVID and he can't have visitors. And he's had that COVID now for more than a week. So if you can remember the name or write it down, and Fred Mobley, spelled Mobley. You might think it's like Mobley, but he pronounces it Mobley. And these are prayers. Walter up in Canada, I appreciate your several emails. And in one of his emails, Walter mentioned he'd like me to cover. Now, I covered a little bit last week and we played a video by Mr. Armstrong on the 6 of the 7 church eras. Now, the 7th church era, we can't say a whole lot about it, except that it's a church era that will have people who become part of that church era when it begins. It has not begun yet, and those of you who are listening to ministers or anyone who is saying, oh, we're in the Laodicean era now. Every one of the people who are saying that are preaching contrary to a truth that God gave us through his end-time apostle, Herbert Armstrong. And God corrected Mr. Armstrong before he died on everything that we needed to have corrected that was of any major consequence, as that would definitely be. It has a extremely significant effect and impact on people to be subjected to a wrong teaching that the Laodicean era is here now, when it is not. It does not commence until the 5th seal begins, the Great Tribulation. It doesn't commence as an era until after the events of Revelation 12, which is in chronological order, starting in verse 13 of Revelation 12, especially verse 14, where we're told those who, of the two categories of brethren who exist now, brethren. Let me, first of all, I've explained this like last week in last week's Bible study. I've explained it many times, but it's real simple. There, in the first category, there are those who are being accounted worthy to escape, according to the prerequisites that God gives us in Luke 21, verse 36. It tells us two things to do there. And then God says that you may be accounted worthy to escape all that's going to happen. Now, he was just explaining the 6 seals of Revelation in Luke 21 and in the parallel chapters of Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And 4 of those 6 seals are active, only 4 of them. The first 4, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the white horse of false religion, the red horse of war and rumors of war and world war and the uniting of Europe. That's your second seal. Your third seal depicted by a black horse with a rider on it who's got some scales, balances in his hand, and on one side of the scale has got food, and on the other side of the scale it's got a certain amount of money, showing that food becomes more and more expensive as it becomes, as Christ used the Greek word limos, meaning scarcity of food, or in other words, famine. And then the fourth seal that Christ described in plain language in Luke 21 and in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, the parallel Olivet prophecy chapters. Christ explained in plain language that fourth seal depicted in Revelation 6 by a pale horse, chloros, meaning pale green, with a rider on that horse named Death. The rider of that horse is named Death. You know, how would you like to meet a person whose name was Death? Yeah, I think you'd rather be with someone whose name was Alive or Life or, something lively instead of Death. But you got a rider on this horse, and as we depicted it in the book of Revelation and in television and telecast, we depicted that rider as a very sickly-looking, skeleton bone rider with the cemetery grave tombs riding alongside him, because Revelation 6 says that fourth seal depicted by a pale horse with a rider on the horse named Death is accompanied by Hades, hell, the grave. The word in the King James Bible that's used is hell, but it's rendered from the Greek word Hades, which means the grave. And so you got cemetery tombs riding right alongside of this horse with this rider on it named Death. And Christ described the death, the first 3 seals are pretty much one element each. The first seal, false religion. There are several different ways you could describe false religion. You could pinpoint who's the cause of it. Satan the devil, as God explains it in Revelation 12, verse 9, is and in 1 Corinthians 4 and other places where he's mentioned as the God of this world who remains on the throne of this earth until Jesus Christ returns. Christ has already conquered Satan in the supreme battle for world rulership. Christ is qualified to return and usher in and restore the kingdom of God. And in the process of that, he's going to be taking the God of this world off the throne of this world and escorting him to a wilderness, which the Day of Atonement pictures. All of the holy days of God have a purpose to them in picturing the plan of salvation. Many of you tuned in know that, but some of you new people may not. And I do have some new people. Hello to Alice Brown. Greetings to you. And from New York. And hope you can meet one of our brethren up there. And I'll mention that after I talk to him later and see if I can help arrange that. But I don't know how much Alice will be interested on a long-term basis, because most of you understand John 6:44 and John 6:65. But Walter in Canada, greetings to you, and another gentleman in Canada I'm going to mention in the morning. But Walter, I'm picking on Walter or mentioning Walter because Walter asked me to cover several things, and this is actually a good moment, even though we're well ahead. Now the date, I should have mentioned the dates on the calendar as we open this up tonight. I'm sorry I didn't do that. This is readings to this Friday evening Sabbath service after sunset. If it's sundown where you are, it is now I'm going to have to cheat and go over here and take a quick look at our calendar, where I've got a page called Date Today, and that's showing the 30th day of Kislev, or the 9th month. It's the 30th day of the 9th month on God's holy sacred calendar today, as of sunset today. And in the morning, it'll still be the 30th day of the 9th month, even though on the Roman calendar, tonight, for most of you where you are, it's after sunset, but it's before midnight. And man on his crazy calendar doesn't change the day until midnight. And so until midnight tonight, man's got today's date on the Roman calendar, the Gregorian Roman calendar, showing as the 23rd day of December. After midnight, it'll become, in the morning, it'll be the 24th day of December, the day before a worldwide holiday. We covered in the Bible study, was it last Friday night or the week before? We played a telecast by God's end-time apostle entitled The Plain Truth About Christmas. And then earlier in the week, this week, the BBC did a very interesting short mini video clip that did an expose on how many of the things of Christmas were observed before Christ and come out of paganism. Some of you know that already, but you just, for some reason, have decided to overlook that. But you shouldn't, really. But if you want to know the full details, if you go back to our Bible study 2 weeks ago, you can find that on our homepage from Sabbath.tv, which takes you to a website labeled at cogtv.org. Stands for Church of God Television, not a church group you can join or become a member of while we're scattered, but it represents this ministry, which is an uncompromising ministry. If you catch me, brethren, I throw you a challenge. Dennis, any of you out there. I pick on Dennis because Dennis likes to pick on me and he likes to go back to when I first began doing these live streams after Robert Collins died, who I assisted from behind the camera. And Mr. Collins, longtime minister in Alabama. Practically everybody who came in the church during the days of Mr. Armstrong in Alabama was seen in their initial visit by Robert Collins, who was always the second man, not the lead minister, but always the second minister. And we had many ministers in Alabama. For some reason, there was a lot of shifting of ministers. There were a lot of problems in Alabama, and some of those ministers caused the problems by preaching poison that people in large numbers picked up on, and it caused great divisions in Alabama, and especially in this area near where I am. I'm not in Birmingham. I'm in a city adjacent to Birmingham, but within, I'm within 7, 8, 10 miles of the border of Birmingham, and some evangelists had to come to Alabama. I learned after getting back here to try to straighten out some of the problems we had here. And it was Birmingham that started one of the divisions, one of the vanity plate, blankety blank, named Church of God groups was started right here in Birmingham. And the man who started that, who had been a local Birmingham minister and pastor, there is a distinction between minister and pastor. And according to Carmine Russo, and I followed his reasoning on this. Carmine, I followed you right down the line on this, that we don't have pastors in the church now, because to have a pastor, Carmine's reasoning on this, Mr. Russo's reasoning on this, was that we would have to have government in the church with authority from the top down, appointing this minister or that minister to this area or that area where he would pastor the people in that area. That's passé. That's gone now that we've become scattered, and the leadership that was handed the baton, who was not faithful, who didn't faithfully run with the baton. They laid it down. And instead of the Sabbath, they're teaching against the Sabbath and meeting on a day other than the Sabbath for their worship service, which is contrary to a truth God taught us through the Bible. And some people, you don't need God's end-time apostle to understand that one. There are groups that exist that some of them carried the thread line for the sixth era of the Church of God. In some cases, a very thin thread, but still a thread that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ. And let me tell you where we're going tonight, what we're going to do. I was just talking to you at first for a little bit here. I'm going to follow a suggestion after praying about this that Walter Little up in Canada had for us to cover this subject that I had set up on my front of my refrigerator door some months ago when we were covering that in detail, as to how to count the Pentecost and how to know from which day Passover occurs on, which day of the week Passover occurs on in any given year, what day Pentecost is always going to count out to on God's holy sacred calendar. There's only 4 dates on God's holy sacred calendar. And by the way, I've got the button punched up on our camera over here to mirror image, because on my monitor I'm seeing everything backward. But I've got the mirror button punched so that when you use the front side of the camera, it'll flip it around so you are seeing it left to right, where everything reads 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 instead of 0, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So hopefully that's working properly. And in fact, if I go back to the home page on this monitor that's over just to the side of me here, if it's going to work, there we go, I can take a look and see if it is not doing that. All right, after saying that to you, I can see that it's backward here as I look at it. But as you might be looking at this might be correct. There is something I could do, even while we're on the air, or while we're live streaming. I can go to a setting. Let me do that and see if this will change it, because I may have just set it up backwards from what it should be. 2, because when I changed the mirror image, we knocked it off. So I'm going to pause for a moment while I wait for the monitor to come back up. Oh, and actually, it may not come back up for everybody unless I go to a screen that allows us to recycle. See if we can get it from here. To recycle, I just got to retype it in there again. Recycle the video multi-stream. I know we may be back on for some folk, but I wasn't able to test that. I wasn't able to test that before going live, because I have to go live to test it. So we found out that it's not working. And I have to go into our multicast software and toggle the multicast off for a minute. Our signal back now. Well, we went off on Facebook. Let me see. It's trying to connect. It does. It says connected. Okay, we should be all right. All right, I'm going to assume we're okay because it does at least say connected. And I'm going to go back to our homepage on Sabbath.tv, cogtv.org, and see if we've got our live stream signal there. And we do. And let me see. Did it turn this? Hey, even though we had some dead air there for a little bit, it does look like it flipped the screen around to show the way it should show. So our dead air time at least helped us straighten this out. And as I explain this, it's going to be much better having it viewable for you where it reads left to right instead of flipped around the other way. All right, brother, again, because this is part 2 and it'll start a new video, this is the Sabbath service for Friday night, Sabbath Eve, the 23rd day of December on the Roman calendar. It is the 30th day of the 9th month on God's holy sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar. That means that after the Sabbath, it will become the first day of the 10th month on God's calendar. And so just for a point of perspective of where we are on the calendar for the holy days coming up, we'll have all of the 10th month, all of the 11th month, all of the 12th month, and there's only one 12th month. There's not a 13th month this year because this is not an extended year. It's not a pregnant year, sometimes called a leap year, but there's not a leap year on the Hebrew calendar, although some Jewish people even have started referring to the extended years or pregnant years as leap years. That's not really correct terminology, but as long as we know what they mean by it, don't get confused. As long as there's no confusion, even though it's not precise language to call the extended years leap years. All right, as we take a look, as Walter suggested, good time, there's the 10th month, 11th month, 3 months before we get to a new year. And then once we hit the new year on the first day of the first month, we count 14 days into it, and on the evening of the 14th day, which this year will be Tuesday night, April 4, we will conduct the Passover memorial service, where we do foot washing, breaking of the bread, and drinking of the wine, representing God's blood, representing his broken body, and picturing the whole thing where Christ gave his life to justify us to the Father, to pay the penalty of our sins, and to bridge that gap that was created after Adam and Eve, with him leading the way, actually. Eve leading the way and Adam following her, in disobeying God and committing a sin that cost all of mankind to be cut off from God, except for a few that God is calling now during what God refers to by agriculture standards a spring harvest, which is a smaller harvest. Just a few people God is calling now. Now, does that mean those he's not calling now are left out? No way. They come in the much greater, colossal, magnificent, wonderful fall harvest. And they won't have the devil around to be troubling them and tempting them with sin and broadcasting to their minds attitudes of envy, jealousy, vanity of all kinds, lust and greed. And that's going to be a wonderful time. So, and it's God's determination. I mentioned earlier before we cut off John 6:44 and John 6:65 that says, none can come to Christ speaking that in person as he said it, none can come to me except the Father which sent me, Christ, draws a person. So those of you who have truly been called into God's church and chosen to be part of the springtime harvest, you have been directly called by God the Father. Now, is there an exception to that? Well, according to God's end-time apostle and the apostle Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians 7, and as God gave us a new understanding, revealing simply what has been written, and it's like we never caught that part of the jigsaw puzzle before. God's end-time apostle was given understanding to explain to us what is being said there that related to several subjects. Divorce and remarriage, it related to a subject that I had been really wondering about, and that new understanding explained it as to how kids who grow up in the church, how they're called. Because people that don't have a parent in the church and don't grow up in the church and they are in the world before God calls them, it's very obvious their calling is a distinct calling, and it's a fulfillment or a related to John 6:44 and John 6:65, where again Christ said, none can come to him except the Father which sent me draws him. So what about 1 Corinthians 7, church kids who have at least one parent in the church, who grew up in the church and heard the truth, and you see many of them go off into the world and then do their own thing after they grow up. Others come on into the church. So how do those kids, how does the calling and choosing work for them? Well, we've explained this before, and it basically comes down to that kid being, as God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong explained it, not being cut off from God the way the rest of the world's kids are cut off. And yet they have to make a decision and tell God, you know what, I want this calling. I want this to be part of this spring harvest. I want to be in the first resurrection, not the second. And especially not the third. But, you know, if they just ignore it, they become like the kids of the world, and they become subject to the second resurrection. Now, that was the explanation from God's end-time apostle. All right, let's go on. Walter, I'm going to try to go through this, and then we're going to make tonight short, especially since our video broke up. I got to splice it back together for the archive. And there's a subject that I'm working on that's very interesting. It's a Bible study Mr. Armstrong gave, and I asked several of you if you could help me with the transcript. None of you were able to. Well, that turned into a blessing because I found a service that is not that expensive. I paid them today, and I got their help. They got more than 90% of that transcript accurate. I'm going through it, making little small changes to it. The transcript I had that I sent to several of you that some other people put together, which had they done it perfectly, I would have given them credit and even asked them, do you mind if I use your transcript? Except, you know, what can you say? The truth of God you can't squash it, you know, but we would acknowledge the other people's work. Well, I'm not going to acknowledge the work because it was very poorly done, and I'm not going to say who did it for that reason. But we have a transcript that the company I hired did an outstanding job, and there's just a little bit of touch-up I'm going through it. And as I do that, I'm also setting aside the display scriptures, and I'm going to try to patch together some of my equipment that I can take portably now because I got some new laptops when some of our other equipment went out on us and during a trial that we had here. I get that patched together, and I'll be able to put the scriptures up there alongside the scrolling text, a perfect scrolling text, while Mr. Armstrong speaks. And it's a rich subject, and one that I hope you'll be looking forward to, a good Sabbath service in the morning with that long talk by Mr. Armstrong. Now, we won't have him here tonight. I'd hoped to be able to have that tonight, but not having it, I can be sure and cover what Walter Little from Canada asked me to cover, and good timing for that. We should be thinking of this ahead of time, and then, brethren, if people ask you a reason of the hope within you, why? And I had that come up just this past week. I received a question from somebody who didn't know of my live streams before. They just bumped into me and said, "Hey, you're in the church?" Well, yes, I have been for a long time. And I'll try to introduce him to you tomorrow. He was born in the year that Mr. Armstrong died, and his father in the church. And he has an extremely interesting background. Was 10 years in one group, went to another group. Now he's independent, and he understands. Then he ran into me where I'm preaching, against division. I'm preaching in favor of what God said in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and beginning in verse 10, that we should all speak the same thing and that there should be no divisions among us. And yet, it seems like, so many of the ministers wanted to tear that page out of their Bible or just ignore it. When the apostasy came up, was a time to fast and pray, not just jump ship and go, off, we're going to do this. He started something that a lot of people followed, but God's instruction here works very much against it. I'll just read this verse real quickly, and then we're going to go on and cover this subject. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name, which means by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be let's have some fun with this, and that there be 100 or 1,000 different divisions among us, with this minister creating a vanity plate name with this adjective, and this other minister over here creating a vanity plate group with that adjective, and they all changing the truth of God in some way that makes this or that subject contrary to what God taught us and did not change before his end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong died. And only an apostle can set doctrine in the church. And so, with the apostle Herbert Armstrong having died, the doctrines we have stand. And yet, some of these ministers want to place themselves in authority and say, "Well, we don't need to do that. We don't need to acknowledge that truth anymore or live by it. But that you may be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment." A lot of you ministers are facing judgment for your compromises. All right, that's all I'm going to say about that tonight. But I did say it. Some of you don't like it. Some of you call me up once in a while and say, "Hey, Steve, I got a tip or two for you. I like what you're doing. You could improve a little bit if you do this or that. And by the way, don't talk against our church division." Well, I'm sorry, when God inspires me to do that, brothers, I have to do it. And, you should pay attention. I didn't write this book of 1 Corinthians or any of the rest of it. But we all have to live by not bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God and that was written in this book. This is the written word of God. We do have to live by all of it and not as if it were tear a page here and a page there out of the book. Okay, now what can we understand? Some key things that will be easy for you to remember when someone asks you, as they did me earlier this week, why do we no longer keep Pentecost on Monday? Well, it's actually a good question. Why were we, and so is another question. Well, why were we keeping it on Monday at all in the first place? I can explain the answers to both of those questions to you if you stay tuned through the rest of this, and I'll try to do this quickly, and I'd like to sign us off early if you don't mind tonight. It's a very cold night here in Alabama where I am. In fact, it's so cold, there are predictions of snow in some parts of the state. Could happen here if we just had rain. It's cold enough to turn it into snow. Extremely cold. All right, but here's the first thing to observe. For the year 2023, on the Roman calendar, we use that reference. And the new year on God's, which begins in just about a week from now. Let's see, today's the 23rd. Tomorrow, during the Sabbath daytime part of tomorrow, the 24th day of December, add 7 more to that. And the following Sabbath will be the last day of December, and then a week from Sunday will be the new year on the Roman calendar, which is not really, it's not of God. So it's just a reference in this world. We have to go by to live and relate to people that tell you got to work on this date, you got to be in court on that date. They're referencing the Roman calendar, so we have to be familiar with it. But we should, brethren, should we not be more familiar with the dates on God's calendar and start to be thinking in terms of God's calendar? Now, what is today? I already told you earlier, but what is the date today on God's calendar? And by today, I mean since sunset tonight, which will go all the way through the morning and afternoon of Saturday until sunset, next sunset, on Saturday, sunset. Well, I do have a help for you. You can find it on our webpage, and you can Google it and find it on a lot of pages. But just for easy reference and for just showing the date today, I have a button over on the right side of our webpage. This is the home page for Church of God Television Ministry, with the acronym for Church of God Television being COGTV, not a church group you can join or become a member of. It represents this ministry that we do on television or live streaming. And we have a webpage with that reference to it. You can get to it by typing in Sabbath.tv. Just incidentally, I'm very grateful to God. We almost lost that domain because I slipped up, didn't pay the bill on it last month. And we only have to pay it once a year. So these annual bills, I really have to track those because that slipped up on me. And I had to what's called redeem that domain name before it got picked up by somebody. Now, I lost one in the middle of last year that I would like to have kept. I'm not going to tell you what it was. And one of these companies that scoop up when people miss paying their domain name bills, scooped it up, and it's now for sale for like $16,000. And, it just cost us what? For that domain name, it would have cost us just a little over $10 a year. And if I hadn't have missed the bill and then let a month or two go by and lost it, so that these companies that specialize when people lose their domain name for a short time and they don't get in there and redeem it and pick it up themselves, they grab it and then put a priority price on some of them. But anyway, we were able to keep that from happening for Sabbath.tv, a domain name I'm thankful to have because it's simply Sabbath and we're TV while we're scattered, so it's Sabbath.tv, and it takes you to our cogtv.org website. And on this website, if you scan down on the right side, see, am I holding this where you can see it? On the right side where the menu area is, if you go to the calendar button, or just go ahead and go directly to the date today button, except, wait a second, that didn't take right away. So if we go to the calendar button, we've got the cross-reference Roman calendar dates for all of the feast days in 2023 already here highlighted on the calendar page for you. It's grayed out right now because I pushed the button and it went to the calendar page, and it it grays out when you do that. And then right below the banner, the first thing it's showing is the feast days for 2023, where the Hebrew dates are cross-referenced to the Roman calendar days. Let's see, have we got where you can see all of that on there? Okay, so that's on the calendar page. And then if you scroll down just a little bit lower with the menu selections, you'll see one that says Date Today. And if you press that button, it will take you to a page that shows a window with, it has both, and I made it bigger so you can see the Roman Gregorian calendar date a little bit larger than it was showing before. Tonight is December 23rd, but on the Hebrew calendar, it's the 30th day of Kislev, the 9th month, and it's in the morning. Even though this will change to December 24, it will stay the 30th day of the 9th month because that date won't change until sunset on Sabbath, at the end of the Sabbath. And if you want to know, well, how do I figure out what month number, since God references the month by numbers, is this Jewish reference to Kislev? Well, if you scroll down past the yearly calendar for 2023, which is pocket size, you can print it on a cardstock, cut it out to fit in your wallet or in a purse, and you'll be able to tell people who ask you, hey, can you be in court on this day? Can you work for me on this day? Or can we meet and have lunch on this day? Or whatever, the family's going to do something. No, I can't be there that day because that's a feast day in my church. So that's there for you. You can cut out your own. Don't even have to bother sending a self-addressed stamped envelope, which I used to ask you to do to get the cards that I printed up for you. And I didn't print any of them up this year. I just put it on the website for you. You can print it and take a pair of scissors and cut it. And if you have your local library or if you've got a printer yourself and run some cardstock in it, you print it on a cardstock and have a nice business-like card to carry around in your wallet or purse. But below that, there's a reference that I made the headline bigger, names of the months on God's calendar. And if you scroll down to where you find Kislev, and it's this 9th month, Kislev, is got a bunch of different spellings for it, some with a CH, some with a K, and several different, 5 or 6 different variations of how to spell that 9th month Hebrew name that is referenced by the Jewish people. But it comes out, you can see it over here, as month number 9, and that ends at the end of the Sabbath. The 9th month is over, and it becomes the first day of the 10th month, which will then show as a reference of either being Tebeth. Well, that's only for the 10th month. There's not a whole bunch of different spellings. On the Hebrew system, it's simply one word, one Hebrew-like word, Tebeth, found in Esther 2, verse 16. Tebeth means the 10th month on God's holy sacred calendar. Okay, so you can find that easy reference on our webpage. Again, today on the Hebrew calendar is the 30th day of the 9th month. And having said that, and reminding you that if you go to the page called Calendar, you've got the feast days cross-referenced to the Roman dates for you here. We can see that Passover this year is Wednesday, April 5, but we observe it Tuesday night, April 4, just after sunset, the evening before April 5. Now, knowing that about what day of the week the first feast day of the year is, will tell you, without having to do the arithmetic or the counting, it'll tell you, if you know this formula, it'll tell you which day on God's holy sacred calendar, the Hebrew calendar, which day Pentecost will fall. Pentecost can only fall on one of 4 different dates in the 3rd month on God's holy sacred calendar. Those 4 dates are the 10th, the 8th, the 6th, or the 5th day of the 3rd month. Now, when you really study the calendar, and at Ambassador College, we had to study we had a whole year of the Hebrew calendar. We had 2 semesters, full semesters. And if I remember correctly, that class met 4 or 5 days a week. And we really worked that Hebrew calendar. And that enables me to be able to explain a few things to you and to have figured out a few things that may or may not, that may be helpful to you. With all the different compromises people make, and the calendar is one that really gets argued, for you to know how doctrine was set on it, how God explained the understanding of it to us, corrected us a couple of different times where we had some things wrong. The first thing we had wrong, well, I'll cover that in a moment. Let me just go ahead and give you this formula and just tell you why knowing what day of the week Passover, when you know what day of the week Passover falls on in any given year, and in the coming year, Passover will occur on a Wednesday. We'll observe memorial service the evening before, after sunset, on Tuesday night, but Passover runs through sunset the next day. And largely is considered, Wednesday would be Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth day of the week. And when Passover occurs on the fourth day of the week, then Pentecost works out to be the 8th day of the 3rd month. Now you have to count this to get that, but once you've counted it and you see this and you relate it, you do a spreadsheet like Mr. Armstrong told us to do, you see where things fall on the spreadsheet with relative to, what happens in a year when Passover is on the 2nd day of the week, which would be a Monday. Well, in that year, Pentecost always comes out to be the 10th day of the 3rd month. And when you work out a spreadsheet and you put this down and it always comes out that way. Now, if you find that there's some rare exception somewhere to that, brethren, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know first. But I don't think you're going to find an exception. I have worked this and worked this and worked this. And even though I haven't heard anybody else teach this, and I came up with this, my own little brainy self, and there you go, Dennis, you got something you can shoot at me with there. But you need to be careful, because when you attack the truth, as you are doing, you're going to have to answer to Jesus Christ for that. Now, I said it. If you heard it, or your friends heard it, Wesley, if you're going to put a bug in his ear, or Gary, you guys that love to punch creepy words against those who remain faithful to the doctrines God set for us in the church and the truth God gave us through his end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, you are going to have to answer for that directly to Jesus Christ. Oh, you laugh and you make fun of us who stand firm on the truth. But, I don't take it the way you guys maybe intend for it to be taken. You don't actually upset me. You've actually, whether you realize it or not, you've actually in some cases caused people to tune into this live stream who would not otherwise have tuned in. And some of them have contacted me, told me what you said. And they said, well, Stephen, when I listened to you, I didn't find you to be as bad as these guys said you were. And what I expected because of what they said, I didn't find to be the truth. One of them even wrote that on your website there, Dennis. And apparently you either didn't see it or couldn't take it off or whatever. But, look, when I was in college and you were 2 years ahead of me, the guy I'm referring to as Dennis, I'm not going to mention his last name, he impressed me as a guy who was an all-American type, and he is, but he probably falls into the same category that, I don't know if I should mention the man's name or not, a minister I loved. He was a minister in Lakeland, Florida, when I first came in the church, and really did a nice job in helping put together an annual church dance at Lakeland that, even though Lakeland's a long way from Miami, Florida, a lot of us, especially the guys, would drive up from Miami to Florida because there were only, let's see, how many guys were there? Maybe 30, 40, 50 guys, single men in the church, young single men in the Miami church when I first came in the church. And there was only there were two single women in that age range. And at all, two single women. All the rest of the women were married women in the Miami congregation. And some of those fellows, they wanted to be married, and since we were instructed not to marry outside the church, they'd have to wait till feast time to run into other single women in the church. But this church dance that was done in the middle of the year or springtime or something like that, oh man, the Miami single men, they drove up in, a convoy of cars and men going up to that church dance. And the assistant minister there really worked hard to help put on that dance. It was a nice dance that year. This would have been back in, I think, 1969. And unfortunately, that minister, during the time of the apostasy, left the church. Now, when he was in Pasadena for about 6 or 8, maybe even as long as 10 months, on the Sabbath after services at Pasadena, he would often come over to my house. I was doing real estate seminars at that time. I rented a movie producer's house in Pacific Palisades, right on the ocean, 180-degree view of the ocean. And this minister and his wife and their just children would come over every Sabbath afternoon and spend that Sabbath afternoon with us. And at that place overlooking the ocean and have a meal together. And then during the apostasy, even though he didn't form a church group of his own and he didn't go into Sunday keeping and all that, he just left the church and eventually stopped keeping Sabbath. And when I went to him a couple of times and talked to him at his home then in Texas, he said, Stephen, he says, I think he had been in West Point, and he said, I think what happened is that my coming into the church was not a John 6:44. It was just a fluke. I was amazed that that former minister himself, who once he went apostasy and he spoke very strongly against Mr. Tkach while Mr. Tkach was still alive, the senior. And he wound up being, they still did disfellowshipments then. He wound up being disfellowshipped. I didn't know that until after he explained to me that, I think it was just a fluke that I came into the church and wound up in the ministry even. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. And that is because some of you fellows that love to punch away at the truth and really make fun of God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, and you throw into the same boat anybody who stands up for the truth God gave us through God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong, you try to pick on us. And yeah, okay, we're human. And, when I first took this over and had to do the live streams, the man who was doing it, asked me to keep things going. I tried to find somebody else to take it, and I couldn't find anybody else to take it. And after fasting and prayer, I said, all right, I'll take this on a temporary basis till somebody else comes along who can take it. And 10 years have gone by, and even though we've had some obstacles, I continue to be encouraged to still be here. And even though some of you guys that like to poke fun and point back to when I first started, I admit, I agree with you. Just like a guy starting out in Spokesman's Club or Ambassador Club, some of his first speeches will be creepy, if you want to use that term. Although I think that's kind of a strong term, and I sure wouldn't want to say that to a person who's making an effort trying to learn. You'd want to be a little more gentle with it. But, okay, you punched me in the face with these creepy words. Dennis, Gary, you supported him, and now I understand, Wesley, you are too. That's okay. You actually brought me some more viewers, so thank you. Although the way you did it, you're going to have to answer for, not to me, but to Jesus Christ. All right, enough said? I think so. I'll have a dill pickle tonight and enjoy it. All right, now, some of you know what I mean by that. I got a dill pickle jar upstairs. Okay, and that relates to Dennis. There are only 4 days of the week on which Passover can occur. That's the way God set it up on his calendar. That's a rule of the calendar. Passover can only occur in any given year on one of 4 days. Those 4 days are the 2nd day of the week, the 4th day of the week, the 6th day of the week, or the 7th day. I've got a 0 up here. I'll explain why that's a 0 and not a 7 in a moment. But 2, 4, 6, 7. And as you know, if you count from Sunday on the Roman calendar, the 2nd day is Monday. So Passover can occur on a Monday. The 4th day would be a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Passover can occur on a Monday, a Wednesday, or the 6th day would be a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, a Friday, the 6th day of the week, or on the 7th day, a Sabbath. So Passover can only occur on a Monday. I'll say it this way first. I'm going to say it according to God's holy sacred calendar. Passover can only occur on the 2nd day, the 4th day, the 6th day, or the 7th day of the week. Which said another way, for those of you who want to think in Roman calendar terms, Passover can only occur on a Monday, a Wednesday, a Friday, or a Sabbath. Now, the formula for Pentecost, which is over and above, and it's not a biblical instruction. It's just the way it works out. If you know this, you can use it like a cross-check. Like a lot of banking institutions and things will set up little cross-checks for their numbers, where that cross-check number, the other numbers have to add up to that cross-check number. They do that for a security reason. Well, I don't know if God designed it this way on purpose, but it just happens to be that if Passover occurs on the 2nd day of the week, a Monday, then Pentecost is always going to be the 10th day of the 3rd month on God's holy sacred calendar. If Passover occurs in a given year, as it does this coming year in 2023, on a Wednesday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the 4th day of the week, a Wednesday, then Pentecost is always going to come out to be the 8th day of the 3rd month. Now, for the other 2 possible days that Passover can fall on in a given year, and it changes from year to year, if Passover occurs on a Friday, the 6th day of the week, then Pentecost is going to occur on a Sunday, the 1st day of the week, which is the 6th day of the 3rd month. Can you? Is that in view? I think it is. And then the remaining day that Passover can occur on, if Passover occurs on a Sabbath, and it can occur, Passover can be on a Sabbath, then Pentecost that year when Passover occurs on a Sabbath will always be on the 5th day of the 3rd month. That's just the way the 50-day counting works out for if Passover is on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Sabbath. Now that we've explained that, let me just put these 7 days of the week on the same line here for a moment. And now that you know that Passover this coming year for 2023 occurs on a 4th day of the week, a Wednesday, and we know Pentecost is going to have to come out to be the 8th day of the 3rd month. And then we've already cross-referenced that for you on the pagan Roman calendar, and I have that on this little card, and this card for 2023 again is printed on the calendar page. I'm going to go to the home page for just a moment, and from the home page you can see this calendar button a little easier. It's blue, it's got a blue background, and it's purple. Now, as soon as I press it, that button is going to turn gray and gray out, and it'll take you to the calendar page, and you see the page just changed. And the calendar button went gray on us. But if we look at the date for Pentecost this year, we've already counted it out and cross-referenced it to the Roman calendar. It's the 28th day of May, 2023, a Sunday, first day of the week. I'll answer that question in a moment as to why we no longer observe Pentecost on a Monday, but on a Sunday. We'll go through that. I'll try to do it as simply as I can and give it to you so you can remember it and be easy for you. But let's see, what did we just say? The date for this year for Pentecost is, I just had a calendar in my hand, a little pocket calendar. It's on our website on the calendar page on cogtv.org or sabbath.tv. Press the calendar button and you can see all the feast days for the whole year. And as we pulled it up there, it showed that Pentecost this year is for 2023 is the 28th day of May. And sure enough, that's exactly what we've got on inside this little pocket calendar that's got all the year references on it. 28th day of May. Now, if you check a Hebrew calendar, the 28th day of May, you should find that it's going to be, on the Hebrew calendar, it's going to be the 8th day of the 3rd month, just because that's the way this formula works. And for those of you that really want to take some time and go through it and figure it out, if you go to this calendar page by hitting the calendar button from our homepage. Our homepage has the banner at the top. And then the first window below it has our live stream. When we're live, you'll see me or Mr. Armstrong in there. And then over on the right side is the menu items. Now, if you press this calendar button and go below where the feast days for all the feasts for 2023 are listed with the Roman calendar dates, if you scroll down below that to where we have the 2023 Roman calendar with the feast days highlighted with a color behind the date, you'll see that in May 28th, it's got the purple date behind it. It's the first day of the week. And now that does not show you that that's the 8th day of the 3rd month. That just shows you the Roman calendar date that we crisscross to. But if you go over here, here's a way to see what I was just telling you up there and some detail about it and some reference where if you really want to study it, we've got what happens to the different dates for a lot of things when Passover occurs on a Sabbath. Let's see. Oh, that's trumpets. What about Passover? When Passover occurs on a Friday, a Sabbath, a Monday, or a Wednesday, here's what happens relative to the other feast days. So that's got that purple background to it. But then down below that, after we have full yearly calendars for last year and the year before, and even we go beyond 2023, and we have one there already there for you for 2024. But down below that, here's a reference to what I have on the refrigerator door there, that if Passover occurs on a Monday, a Wednesday, a Friday, or a Sabbath, here's the dates on the Roman calendar that the weekly Sabbath will occur on, the Wave Sheaf Day will occur on, and Pentecost will occur on. And I've got those dates I just gave you. So if you want to study this, right here on this particular graphic on the calendar page. And then below that, I've got, now this was for a certain given year, with the way those dates worked out. But below that is a generic one where we just count, let's see, the one that would be generic would be the one that's got related to the Roman calendar dates. Yeah, and that's this first one. And in this particular case, the 14th day Passover for the year that this applied to occurred on a Sabbath. Now this year, Passover is occurring on a Wednesday, so that would throw these numbers different. And you see that year, with Passover occurring on a Sabbath, Pentecost came out to be on the 5th day of the 3rd month, the way it counts. And you see, that's exactly what we show as a reference here. If Passover is on a Sabbath, Pentecost is the 5th day of the 3rd month. let's see. Do I have a generic version? I've got some other calendar things there. All right, we're probably going to have to do this again, Walter, because I only want to hit some highlights tonight. Let us get to bed and get some sleep since I signed on late, and then be ready and fresh in the morning for God's End Time Apostle Herbert Armstrong to cover hour and a half of a Bible study on Romans that I believe you'll find extremely interesting, and we're going to have scrolling transcript that's corrected with all the words correct in it, and have scripture on the screen and some explanations as to why when Mr. Armstrong talks about where ancient Israel was taken into captivity, where he mentions is not mentioned in the Bible. However, what is mentioned in the Bible is shown to be in the same area of where he mentions in his Bible study talk. I'll explain that tomorrow when we get there. It harmonizes what God's End Time Apostle Herbert Armstrong says in this Bible study. It harmonizes it with the facts of geography and history. So he's right on target, and you'll see how some of the details that he taught only in the classes to the ministry, potential ministers attending Ambassador College, and not so much in sermon. You didn't hear people pick up on this in sermons or even on his radio programs, but he did it in this Bible study that we're going to play with lots of video to help you stay right with him on it, and explanations that will help you see that what he is saying is backed up from maps, geography, and history. But this year, again, Passover will occur on a fourth day of the week, a Wednesday. And what then happens is, let's cover this, let's pull these back down for a moment. The first correction God had to make for us in the church through God's leadership, through his end-time apostle and most faithful servant, Herbert Armstrong, was to instruct us that where we had been from the very early days, when I say we, a lot of us weren't here in those most early days, but the church of the Philadelphia era, through its leader, Herbert Armstrong, began, they observed Pentecost the same way the Jewish people observed it, by counting from the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread. Now, by doing that, since the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread is always the 15th day of the first month, it's always the day after Passover. The first day of unleavened bread is the day after Passover. That means you count 50 from that day every year. It comes out to be the 6th day of the third month. Every single year. Never changed. So there actually was no need to count to Pentecost. You didn't need to count 50. Just one time only. Because once you count it one time, counting from the 15th day of the first month, the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread, 50 days later on the Hebrew calendar from the 15th day of the first month is always the 6th day of the third month. Now, when I saw that, I began to say, well, what about these other dates? You know, if you count from a different day, will it always come out different? But here's the first correction God made. And he instructed Mr. Armstrong that you count not from the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread, but you count from the weekly Sabbath that either occurs on Passover or the first Sabbath after Passover. Either Passover or the Sabbath after Passover, that is in essence occurring during the days of unleavened bread. Now, Passover itself, you could say, well, that first day of unleavened bread is the day after Passover. Well, it's an exception. Hey, brother, hold on 1 second. I see a problem. All right, I'm in the kitchen, and I'm wondering why my floor was getting wet, and my shoes and my feet have gotten wet. I turned on the water a little bit more than I should have because of the extremely low temperatures outside. Like I think they were around 17 degrees, something extremely cold. It's a bitter cold. And my sister called me and said, be sure and turn on all your pipes. If you're in a cold area, you probably want to do that too, so none of your pipes will burst. Well, I set a bowl in the sink, and it must be blocking the drainage because the water was overflowing out of the sink and is now down on the floor. It's okay, though. I got a heater down here. It's on the floor also. And I'll mop it up after we sign off. But let me sign off, because we got some weather conditions here that cause you to have to deal with some emergency things sometimes. But where we were here is that this year, Passover is occurring on the fourth day of the week, a Wednesday. Now, the first correction to us was that we count from the weekly Sabbath, not from the annual Sabbath. Well, you say, okay, all right, Stephen, so God corrected us. Well, then, when did that correction occur? That correction occurred in 1937. Many of you who know the history of God's end-time apostle Herbert Armstrong know that God began to call him in 1926 and had him understanding by the fall of 1926 that we should keep the annual holy days. The first Passover and Pentecost that God's end-time apostle kept was in the spring following that fall of 26, the spring of 1927. And many of you know this history and the story of how Herbert Armstrong and his wife Loma observed those feast years for 7 years by themselves, even though Mr. Armstrong taught the Sardis era church that we should be keeping the annual Sabbaths, not just the weekly Sabbaths. They all refused. And the leadership, which even acknowledged, Mr. Armstrong, you're right, we should be keeping the annual Sabbaths, but I'm not going to teach the brethren that because we'll lose them. He didn't believe the Sardis brethren had the spirit to keep the annual Sabbaths or to receive that instruction. And he was right. Even to this day, when some have asked some different groups, could they come and attend the Feast of Tabernacles with them, and were granted permission to do that, they got to the feast site and caused division by their attitude and words saying, well, we can keep this holy day, these Feast of Tabernacle days, if, the big IF, if we want to. And they would tag and add to that, but we don't have to. Buzz, wrong. The annual Sabbaths are commanded as fully and strongly as the weekly Sabbath. So that teaching, that attitude, is like a rotten apple among pure apples. It would cause some people to say, oh, well, we don't really have to keep this day. That would wear into you if you allow those people to continue to fellowship with you. So I was happy that the minister leading that group told those people the next year, you may not attend with us. You can go to the same city we go to, but you're not coming into our services. We're going to ask our brethren to not fellowship with you who are teaching things compromising and contrary to the truth. The truth is we keep both the weekly and the annual Sabbaths. So God made that first correction in 1937. So let's take the years. Mr. Armstrong and Mrs. Armstrong were keeping Pentecost with the Jewish people, counting Pentecost from the annual Sabbath for the years from 1927 through 1936. So how many years would that have been? That would have been 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. For 10 years, the first 10 years that Mr. Armstrong kept the feast days, including Pentecost, he was observing Pentecost on the 6th day of the 3rd month, and that fell on a different day of the week every year, but it always fell on the 6th day of the 3rd month. When you cross-relate that to the Roman calendar, it'll be a different day of the week. Now, the first several years that Mr. Armstrong was keeping that with Mrs. Armstrong, they were doing that during the Sardis era. It wasn't until 1933 that the Philadelphia era formally began or commenced. And so, for the years of the springtime feast of 1933, 1934, 1935, and 1936, for 4 years, the first 4 years of the Philadelphia era of the Church of God, Mr. Armstrong and that Philadelphia era that began with 19 members in 1933 were keeping Pentecost by counting it from the annual Sabbath. In 1937, they were planning on keeping Pentecost on the annual, by counting from the annual Sabbath, but just days before Pentecost, Mr. Armstrong changed the bulletin that had been issued an emergency bulletin correcting. Mr. Armstrong, when we made mistakes, he would correct them. So you fellows that are teaching, you can't correct a mistake that Mr. Armstrong or the work prints or publishes. Oh, yes, you can, and Mr. Armstrong would have been the first one to do it, were he alive. And if he's not alive, anybody else who corrected an error, an obvious, well-known, documentable error, like a date of when a pope crowned or held the coronation ceremony for this or that pope, as occurred in one of our printings, 2 dates were printed incorrectly. Well, Mr. Armstrong would have been the first one to yank that publication and issue a corrected publication. And so when I corrected that on the chart, oh man, I thought I was never going to hear the end of flack over that. I guarantee you, when we see Mr. Armstrong, if that subject were to come up, or with Jesus Christ involved, some of you guys would have to be eating crow, as an old expression goes. All right. Now, I've made mistakes, and when I do, I hope to be the first to admit them. But I don't make mistakes just out of stubbornness, where you guys should be teachable and correctable, and you took a hard line. And if you're still holding on that, you're continuing to make a mistake. But all you got to do is repent of it, and you can be forgiven of it. Same thing, Dennis, for you, for Gary, for anybody else you're inspiring to hop aboard your boat with a leaky hole in your boat. All right, but I don't want to pick on those guys the way they pick on me. I said I've said enough, so I should stop right there for now. I'll wait till I hear more that these guys have tried to say against me. But all right, first correction was in 1937. After 4 years of the Philadelphia era, with 6 years of Mr. Armstrong alone with his wife. You don't count 1926 because he didn't start the spring feast until 1927. So 6 years of 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. Mr. Armstrong and Mrs. Armstrong keeping them at home alone as part of the Sardis era. Then, in 1933, after the 19 members came along, God commenced a new era, the Philadelphia era of his church, with 19 members. In 1933, the spring of 1933, there were 4 years, 33, 34, 35, 36, that the first 4 years of the Philadelphia era, God's church was observing Passover by counting Passover from the annual Sabbaths. It wasn't until the 5th year, until 1937, and then you start a whole new counting of how, we were then observing Pentecost by counting it under corrected instruction that we misunderstood. God had given Mr. Armstrong the understanding that you count not from the annual Sabbath, but from the weekly Sabbath. Walter, you got that? It's really simple. The rest of you, just make yourself one simple note. In 1937, God made the first correction to his church that we should be counting Pentecost not from the annual Sabbath, but from the weekly Sabbath. Now, from 1937 through 1973, how did we, for those 37 years, I think that's, if you add the numbers up, it's 37, 36 years. When you add it to the first 4 years that we were counting from the annual Sabbath, you add the years from including 1937 through 1973, you'll come up with 40 years that we did not know, 40 years of the Philadelphia era. While it was the Philadelphia era, there were 40 years before God made the second correction. 40 years that we did not know how to properly count Pentecost. First 4 years of the Philadelphia era, we were counting it from the annual Sabbath. The next 36 years, let's do a real quick reference, if you don't mind. I know we're live and it's late, but we can do this pretty quick. And then some of you want these details. It'd be good for you to have it. And this is Bible study. We can work things out in a Bible study. How many years, can somebody do this on a piece of paper real quickly? I wish you could flash it up where I could see it. You can put it in the comments and show off a little bit if you want to. I mean, and this is in a good way. I don't mean to make fun of somebody being able to think this out and be able to do it quickly and even assist and help me and make sure we got the numbers right. And if I got it wrong, I want you to tell me, hey, Steve, you didn't do your arithmetic, your math correctly on that. But if we count inclusive of 1937, when we started counting Pentecost with changed instruction. We didn't do the changed instruction correctly, but we thought we were. We were instructed to count from the weekly Sabbath. But because of a wrong word, not in the Hebrew, and the failure to follow the syntax, the grammar that was used in the Hebrew original language that said count inclusive from the wave sheaf day, count including the wave sheaf day as day one. We did a from, instead of counting from the weekly Sabbath, we counted from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, and we counted from it, meaning we began our count 2 days after the weekly Sabbath instead of the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. Does this make sense to you? We were counting it beginning with the day after the wave sheaf day instead of beginning with the wave sheaf day, which, as Leviticus 23 verse 16 says, we count, or verse 15, we count, it should, instead of saying from, it should be saying beginning with the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. I mean, that's the correct understanding. But because of the word from being there, count from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, we went to a whole nother day to begin the count. Instead of making the wave sheaf day, day one, we made the day after the wave sheaf day, number one, and we did that for 36 years, if my arithmetic in my head is correct. Because I know it comes out to Mr. Armstrong, like he said, it was 40 years exactly from the time the Pentecost, from the time the Philadelphia era began as an era, which began in 33, and the first 4 years of it, 33, 34, 35, 36, we were still counting Pentecost from the annual Sabbath. We didn't even get mixed up with from the morrow after, because we were counting from the annual Sabbath. and strictly from the annual Sabbath, always coming out like the Jews do on the 6th day of the 3rd month, counting from the annual Sabbath, which means they began, and the Jews still begin, the count with the wave sheaf day the way they figure the wave sheaf day. But they're not figuring the wave sheaf day to come out on the first day of the week every year. Their wave sheaf day comes out on the 16th day of the first month every year, because they do it on the morrow after the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread. The morrow after the annual Sabbath of the first day of unleavened bread is always the 15th day of the first month. Therefore, the wave sheaf day is always the 16th day of the first month. And that moves around on the calendar to not always be the same day of the week. From year to year, it's a different day. When you count from the morrow, or count beginning with the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, the day after a weekly Sabbath is always the first day of the week. So every year it comes out to be the first day of the week when you count it correctly from the weekly Sabbath, beginning the count with the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, which is the wave sheaf day. All right, now if you don't understand these terms and what things are, that's going to be a big thing. And we don't do anything on the wave sheaf day. So a lot of you say, oh, wave sheaf day, wave sheaf day. What's the wave sheaf day? Well, it's the day that Christ descended to his Father. It was the day that he had to be waved for acceptance. It has a big meaning to it. And during the days of unleavened bread, we should be emphasizing that meaning and at least teaching that on the Sabbath, that tomorrow will be the wave sheaf day. We'll begin the count for the 50-day count. It'll be day number 1 of the 50-day count tomorrow after a weekly Sabbath, where we hold services on a weekly Sabbath. We should be teaching. Tomorrow on the wave sheaf day, we begin the count, day number 1, and that day of the wave sheaf day, we wave the loaves of bread. Some ministers are teaching this, and good, those of you that do. But those of you who don't, you need to get your act together and help brethren. Brethren, you need to study this on your own too. Make sure you know and understand it, because you are in training to be a minister yourself, a priest and a king. The training, the calling is to be a priest and a king in the world tomorrow. So just because you're not one now in this physical life, and I'll tell you the truth, this is the worst time for anybody to be called into the ministry or just to be continuing to be a minister. Most ministers have failed and compromised on the truth, unfortunately, and we're scattered like crazy, divided, worse than scattered. Scattered alone is of God. We can live with that. God has ways, especially through this modern invention of the internet, the World Wide Web, and all the apps and modern devices we have now that you can carry around things portably, even wear a watch like Dick Tracy on your wrist and see, you can see this telecast on a wristwatch now. Amazing time and technology. So the scattering, if it were that's all it were without division, we'd be okay, brethren. All right, but let's go through those 2 corrections, and let's count it out. Did some of you do it on the paper already? And you can catch me on this real quick if I'm wrong. I think from 37, counting 1937, through counting 1973, the last year that we counted Pentecost, from the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, during days of unleavened bread, or from Passover, if Passover occurs on a Sabbath during that year. There should be 36 to make what Mr. Armstrong said come out correct. So let's check it and see if Mr. Armstrong was correct. The Bereans, they checked the words of the original apostles for the purpose of finding that what they taught was true. They didn't try to prove the person wrong, and we're not trying to prove Mr. Armstrong wrong. We're trying to prove him right, actually. So Dennis, you and I hate to pick on these guys or even mention them again. You or Gary or even your other potential friend with WW. You may be hoping, I hope he trips up. I hope his numbering is wrong. Well, If it is, I'll admit it. But we're trying to prove Mr. Armstrong right, that there was 40 years we did not know how to count Pentecost correctly, which shows that we had a period of 40 as the number of trial and testing. Some people flunk that test because instead of going with the second correction to correct how we counted from the weekly Sabbath and stop adding an extra day to it by counting from the wave sheaf day, the day after the weekly Sabbath, we should have been, God corrected us to understand we should be counting beginning with the morrow after the weekly Sabbath, which is a count from the weekly Sabbath. Because the day, if you count from the weekly Sabbath, it makes the beginning day of the count the wave sheaf day, the first day of the week, the next day after the Sabbath. Brethren, you see how God's word is when we understand it correctly and understand the incorrect rendering where they put the word from in there because the original King James translators failed to follow a rule of transliteration where you've got to make sure that the grammar rules in the original source language are carried over into the target language. When we translate it from the source language of Hebrew, the original language God had Moses write these instructions in Leviticus, over to the target language of English, the translators failed to consider the Hebrew grammar that said you count beginning with the wave sheaf day, the morrow after the Sabbath of either Passover or days of unleavened bread. And they used the word from, which meant don't, where Hebrew language was saying include the day, begin the count with wave sheaf, the English translators made it come out grammatically to say exclude the wave sheaf day, count from the wave sheaf day without counting that day as part of the number. Exclude it, count exclusive, not inclusive. And Hebrew language said count inclusive. When Mr. Armstrong was challenged and then called an instructor of Hebrew language at the Hebrew University in Israel, in Jerusalem, and she told him, yes, Mr. Armstrong, you should be including the wave sheaf day in the count. That word from, rendered in the King James Version, is an incorrect translation because of your English grammar rules that say if you count from a day, you don't include that day in the count. She said the Hebrew language doesn't say count from that day. It says count beginning with that day. So your translators should have carried over the transliteration rule of keeping the grammar rule in the source language to be the same in the target language of English. They didn't do that. All right, there's those funny jokes about the lady saying, oh, Jesus Christ said thee and thou, I'm going to say thee and thou. She thinks the English was always was the original Bible language. No. But let's count those numbers. I just want to check and see if there was 36 plus 4 would equal 40 years. We didn't know how to count it correct during the Philadelphia era. So some of you already done it ahead of me. I got to do it in front of you. Starting with 1937, when the first correction was made to say count from the weekly, not the annual Sabbath. We did that from 37 through, not from 37, we did that beginning with the year 37 through 1973. So we did that 37, 38, 39, 40, 1941, 1942, 43, 44, 45, 46. That's 10 years. Then 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56. That's 20 years. 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66. That's 30. 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75. Oops, I'm going too far. 66 was 30. So then 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73. All right, that comes out to be 37. So, where I may be off, there may have only been 3 years in the Philadelphia era that we were counting from the annual Sabbath. And so where we made that correction in 1937, in 36, 35, 34, 34 must have been the first year that the Philadelphia era observed Pentecost with Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong. So if that era began in 1934 after Pentecost, I'll need to check that, because Mr. Armstrong said there were exactly 40 years the Philadelphia era did not know how to count Pentecost correctly. And many people picked up on that and said, yeah, Pentecost is I said 40, the number 40 is a number of trial and testing. And we know those dates that we just went through. We know that 1937 is when God made the correction to count from the weekly Sabbath instead of counting from the annual Sabbath because of the bulletin in 1937, correcting that before Pentecost, just a few days before Pentecost that year in 1937. So 37 through 73, we counted it out. There would be, counting both the first year and the last year, 37 and 73, there would be 37 years. And to come to 40, we'd have to have 38, 39, 40. Just 3 years that the Philadelphia era counted Pentecost before that correction in 1937. Since the Philadelphia era began, there would be 3 years we were keeping it the same day the Jews kept it, counting it from the annual Sabbath. So some of you who have been teaching that, for 40 years we kept Pentecost on Monday. No, we didn't. We only did it on counting it out to a Monday for 37 years. But the other 3 years, we still didn't know how to count it right because we were counting from the annual Sabbath instead of trying to be counting from the weekly Sabbath that we messed up for 37 years by counting it the day after the weekly Sabbath, 2 days after the weekly Sabbath instead of the morrow after. And instead of beginning the count, we were counting from, and it made us count from Monday instead of from a Sunday. All right, so I gave you some heavy details there. Mr. Armstrong always told us, try to keep things simple, don't make them too complex, but when something is complex, make a spreadsheet so you yourself can easily understand it. Now, there's one more thing here. I should cover it tonight because I really want to do a different subject tomorrow. You see over here where we've got 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 going down vertically, and then horizontally they got some other numbers next to them. These represent the 7 weeks that must be complete before we keep Pentecost. The instruction in the Bible does not say 50 days have to be complete. It says 7 Sabbaths, which idiomatically means weeks that begin with the first day of the week, the way it did from creation, through the Sabbath day. 7 of those must be complete. That's 49 days. And then the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you number as day 50, and on that day, you observe the annual feast day, holy day of Pentecost on day 50, the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And that morrow after the 7th Sabbath cycles back around to the first day of the week, which Pentecost always occurs now when we count it correctly, to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, verse 16. That's what made me keep Pentecost on both Sunday and Monday for 3 years between 1971, 2, and 3, before the change in 1974, where God's end-time apostle announced we need to be counting beginning with the morrow after the Sabbath when Passover or Days of Unleavened Bread occur, not from it. We count beginning with that wave sheaf day, not from the wave sheaf day. That occurred in 1974, and then that made it all fall in line because verse 16 of Leviticus 23 says, count, number the morrow after the seventh Sabbath, and the word there is Shabbat, not Shabua for weeks, but the word actually Shabbat, the Sabbath day. So it was saying the morrow after the seventh Sabbath day, your day at number is number 50, and after any week, the morrow after a Sabbath is going to be the first day of the week. But in this case, you do it after the seventh Sabbath day, first day of the week through seventh day weeks, and that's going to be the first day of the week that you number is 50. And on that day, as verse 16 clearly says, you observe that holy day. You do the meat offering and the stuff that we now do as a financial offering. And that triggering Sabbath, when Passover occurs on a Sabbath, that same Sabbath that is Passover is the triggering Sabbath that you count from that weekly Sabbath. And then the instruction that says, beginning with the morrow after that Sabbath, your number is number 1. So on a year when Passover is on the Sabbath, that Sabbath is 0 in the count, and the next day, the day after, the morrow after the Sabbath, is the day you begin the count with as day number 1. And at the end of that week, what happened to my 7? It fell off here somewhere. Here's a 7 down here. Well, I borrowed it for something else. Whoops, now I just dropped it. All right. Oh, no, here it is. Okay. At the end of that first week of counting, the first day through the 7th day, at the end of the first week, 7 days of the 50-day count have been concluded. Then the next week, when you count another first day of the week through the Sabbath, your second week, at the end of that week, at the end of that Sabbath, 14 days of your 50-day count have elapsed. At the end of 3 weeks, 21 days, just add another 7. At the end of 4 weeks, 28 days have passed. At the end of 5 weeks, 35 days have passed. 5 times 7 days in a week. At the end of 6 days, 6 times 7, 42 days have passed of your 50-day count. At the end of this Sabbath, the 7th Sabbath, when that sun goes down, that's Sabbath evening, after the 7th Sabbath, 49 days, 7 times 7 days have been complete. 7 Sabbaths, 49 days have been complete, and the morrow after that 7th Sabbath, you shall number as day number 50. That cycles you back around to the first day of the week, Pentecost. First day of the week, day number 50. This year, May 28th. Brethren, I'm out of time. I went probably the whole hour and a half. We did it in 2, actually maybe 3 spliced up recordings, because when I shifted the camera to get the display correct from left to right, we split that video. It split off that video right there. Thank you for joining me tonight. Walter, I hope I made that clear as not as mud, but I hope I made that clear as a bell for you. And if you need to review it again, if you need to have me go over it again, we probably will before we get to Passover, or at least especially as we get to Passover, and we're going to be counting that. We'll probably do it again. The instruction's pretty simple. It's just in 2 verses in Leviticus 23, verses 15 and 16. In this big print Bible I have here, it begins at the bottom of the page on where verse 15 begins, where the wording is, let's just read that and I'll close with this. And you shall count unto you, this word from should have been rendered beginning with. You shall count unto you beginning with the morrow after the Sabbath, Shabbat, weekly Sabbath, not annual Sabbath, the first day of the week, but weekly Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. Now this clues you so that when we see when ancient Israel went into the promised land, they had to do this wave sheaf offering, and that Sabbath before that year was Passover, and therefore there's a biblical example that when Passover occurs on a weekly Sabbath, that Sabbath triggers when the Wave Sheaf Day begins. Because when they went into the Promised Land, the morrow after that Sabbath, they did the Wave Sheaf Day. Therefore, they were using that Sabbath upon which Passover fell as the weekly Sabbath. And that's the day before Days of Unleavened Bread began. If you do it in the other way, you're going to have the Wave Sheaf Day falling outside of the Days of Unleavened Bread, and it's the Wave Sheaf Day that must occur during the Days of Unleavened Bread. Passover does not have to occur during the Days of Unleavened Bread. The weekly Sabbath that triggers the Wave Sheaf Day does not have to be a technical part of the Wave Sheaf Day. It can be the Passover that precedes the Days of Unleavened Bread in a year when the Passover occurs on a Sabbath, as it will about 10% of the time. 30% of the time, Passover occurs either on a 30% each. It occurs on either a Monday, a Wednesday, or a Friday. And about 10% of the time, it'll fall on a Sabbath from year to year to year to year. Okay. And if you check your Hebrew calendar, that's just a thing you can figure out by observation. But verse 16 goes on to say, I didn't finish 15 yet. It says, beginning with the day that you brought the wave sheaf of the sheaf of the wave offering, the last part of verse 15 of Leviticus 23 says, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. That does not. Let me ask you, does that say 50 days shall be complete, brethren? If you have 7 Sabbaths, or 7 idiomatic expressions of 7 weeks that go from the first day of the week through the Sabbath, if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of those, 7 times 7 is how many days? 7 weeks of first day of the week through Sabbath weeks must be complete. That's 7 times 7. That's not 50. Some of you need some help with your arithmetic and your math. Shall be complete. Then look at verse 16. This is going to really clarify it. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. Now we get totally outside the 7 weeks of first day of the week through Sabbath weeks. 7 of them. The morrow after those 7 times 7. Shall you number 50 days. So the day outside of those 7 weeks becomes a very special day in and of itself. It's not part of those 7 weeks that we count. It is day 50. It is Pentecost. And you shall offer, and what do you do on day 50? You shall offer a new meat offering unto the eternal Lord your God. And then on that day, it goes on in verse 17 to say, you shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves, etc., meaning that is the Wave Sheaf Day on the morrow after. That's the Pentecost Day. The Wave Sheaf Day is back here on the morrow after the weekly Sabbath that begins the count. You begin the count with the Wave Sheaf Day, and then the morrow after the 7th Sabbath is Pentecost. And let me see, are they, they're doing 2 wave loaves. Even, that's interesting. We got to look at this even on the Pentecost day. Okay, they're doing some things that because of the rituals that we don't do today, that we need to take a look at and compare as to how they relate to. We no longer being under the rituals, but the offerings made by fire are now a financial offering. Brethren, I'm going to wrap it up right there. Thanks for joining us. God willing, and the snow doesn't stop us, we have planned to be back here with you in the morning what'll that be? That'll be 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. Is that the way that works? No, that's 10:30 Eastern time and 9:30 Central. We'll be in the video archives for those of you on the West Coast. You can watch it anytime on demand later. It'll be 2:30 in the UK and 4:30 in Israel. So until the morning, I'm going to wish you all a good, happy Sabbath. Thanks for joining me tonight. Shabbat Shalom.